Okay, so this is part 3 of the chapter of social stratification and social class. And we are moving on to the discussion about economic and, well, social inequality in the United States. First thing I need to point out or make sure we understand is the difference between income and wealth. Wealth is what is so outrageously unequal, right? The difference is that wealth is what creates income. Income is the cash you get from work and from wealth. Wealth are the things. So if you've ever played Monopoly, for instance, wealth are the houses. And every time somebody lands on the house, you get income. But it's the fact that you have all the houses. That's the big that's where there's the most profound social inequity. Some people own a whole lot more than everybody else. I used to do this activity in one of my classes where in the beginning I'd pass everybody out a bean, right? And a bean everybody gets the same number of beans, and that would be equal distribution of resources. And then gradually those beans would get concentrated into the hands of fewer and fewer people. The video that I have associated with this one is a video called Perception. It's about perception versus reality. It's like most people, most Americans, we know, for instance, that in the town that I live in, that there are some landlords that own hundreds of housing units, and there are other people that don't even own the house that they live in, right? But we know it's unequal, but we're not necessarily conscious about how profoundly unequal it is. And that's so one important concept to keep in mind is what this idea of worth, net worth. Net worth is what assets you have minus your debts, right? So income is the cash you get from work. Wealth are the things that generate income: your stocks, your bonds, your rental units, your factories, your farmland, your acreage. And then what you rent, your rental units, that's your income. The amount of interest generated from your savings account, that's your income. Your savings account or your stocks, that would be your wealth, right? So your net wealth is what your houses, how many houses you have, how much they're worth, minus what you owe. And sadly, there are some Americans, myself included, we have what's called negative net worth. That means taking into consideration my house and my cars and my stocks and my bonds, and you subtract what I owe. In my case, it's in student loan debt, and I actually owe more than the resources that I have, that I own, right? So you might hear the language about being upside down on your car or upside down. That means that your car, say, is worth only $1,000, but you owe $1,400. You owe $1,400 in payments. You actually owe more than your car is worth. That would be negative, right? That would be negative. So that means what it means to be upside down. In the U.S. today, the most common kind of asset, the way the majority of Americans have their wealth, is tied up in their house. And as in the last 20 years, fewer and fewer people this is why we talk about home ownership, why home ownership is so important, because this is the way most Americans get their first wealth. They buy one house, they make payments for several years, the property value goes up, they sell that house for more than they paid for it in the first place, and they buy a bigger house. And so they continue to increase their wealth. And what's happened in the last 20 years, and what will probably continue to happen, is fewer and fewer Americans own their own house. And certainly is what's happening in Manhattan, is that property values have gone up, but they've gone up because a landlord can put 5 people in them and charge $2,000 rent, whereas a family like my own, we can't pay $2,000 a month in a mortgage, but a landlord can pay that much because they're not paying it because their tenants pay for it. So anyway, so you have right here, net worth that can be generated by home ownership. It can be affected by how long you've been unemployed. Education is thought to increase one's net worth. And of course, you could also inherit your wealth. You could inherit the family farm, you could inherit stocks and bonds, you could inherit rental property, you could inherit a company, you could inherit, a line of grocery stores, and that would be your wealth. Like you may hear the phrase trust, sometimes you'll hear something called trust fund babies. And what trust fund babies are is they're young people whose grandparents or parents set aside a trust fund, and then they turn 21 or 18 and they inherit those stocks and bonds, right? That's wealth. That is inherited wealth. That's what, so social reproduction, when we've talked about social reproduction and what Karl Marx, his concept of how it promotes social inequality. If you're at the top of that social triangle and you have stocks and bonds, and you pass those stocks and bonds on to your children or your grandchildren, then they will be of a similar social class than you, right? That social structure has socially repeated itself. Is it possible for these young people to spend all their trust fund wealth? Sure it is. Is it likely? No, it's not likely. And so they pass, or they inherit a company, and that company then is passed on from generation to generation, and so you maintain. I often find an interesting conversation to think about. If we accept the fact that you can inherit your wealth, do we also accept the fact that you could inherit your poverty? In other words, if poor people can pass on their assets and their social connections and their opportunities, could we imagine a scenario where a poor family who doesn't have social connections, who doesn't have stocks and bonds, who doesn't have help, can they also socially reproduce? They also pass on those lack of connections to their generation. Anyway, so that's what we mean by social reproduction. On the next box, you have, I'm always at a loss for words, of consequences of, so why does any of this matter? The big so what question, that sociologists have been talking about, or that I've been talking about from the very beginning. And I'm likely to put this on a quiz or an exam to offer some explanation or some concept. Why do we care about social inequality? Well, for one thing, we know that people at the bottom, poor people, have shorter life expectancy. They experience worse health. Healthcare is not a right in our culture. The more money you have, the better insurance, the better healthcare. It's just that simple, right? I always think of Alex Trebek, and he developed one of the most deadly forms of cancer, pancreatic cancer. And because he's and he survived, he kicked it. Well, he also had fantastic health coverage, no doubt. Where if a poor person would have developed that disease, I doubt they would have survived. Housing, right? Housing is another one. Obviously, the bigger house, the more money you have, the more choices you have where you can afford to buy a house, where you can afford to rent, how far away you live from people. Education. Now, I got kind of a mixed. Certainly, the character of your education is different if you're going to an Ivy League school versus a two-year technical college. But what I think that's more critical, I don't believe the quality necessarily differs. Having taught at four-year schools and two-year schools, I'm convinced that in some cases you get better instruction at two-year schools. But what is different is your social networks that you're making. When you are at a private Ivy League school, you're going to be making relationships with people whose parents are senators and business, which will help you when you're in the job market. When you are at a school where everybody else is a single mom who's working, for $10 an hour, those people are going to be they're going to have less power and less resources to help you in your future and in your career. All right, I'm going to end this one now, and when I come the next one, we will talk about poverty and some of the explanations for poverty.